We're delighted now to present Lori Bizaler, President and Board Secretary of the Edward W. Hazen Foundation. Lori is going to moderate a panel of 3 grant makers who will share their insights about collaborations and collective impact. Hi, Lori. Please come on up, and I invite the panelists as well. Lori has led the Hazen Foundation since December of 2004. Hi, Kevin. How are you doing? Do you want us to take your phone?
Oh, yeah. Sorry about this interruption. Sorry.
We're full service. Lori has led the Hazen Foundation since December of 2004 and brings over 20 years of experience in nonprofit leadership to the table. She sits on several boards, is a senior fellow with the Center for Social Inclusion, which is a research and policy strategy organization. She works to develop and advocate for public policy solutions to structural inequity and exclusion. Joining Lori this morning, hi everybody, on our panel is Kavitha Medarita, who is the Program Executive, Children and Youth, the Atlantic Philanthropies, Kevin Ryan, who's Program Director of the New York Foundation, and Deborah Thompson Velasquez, Senior Program Officer for the Altman Foundation. Welcome, panelists. Bios about each of them is in your kit. I also want to remind you that you do have index cards in your packets. You know the drill. Have a question, write it down, and our staffers will walk the aisles and they will collect the questions. We will present them to you, and then as many as can be answered will be answered. With that, Lori Bizaler, it's all yours.
Okay. Thanks, Claire. Good morning. Thank you. Good morning. Oh, I like that. As Claire said, I'm Lori Bizaler, and I lead a small national foundation that does work with young people around the country to reverse structural racism that impacts their lives in low-wealth communities and communities of color. A lot of our focus is on education, but I will say that I spent a number of years in jobs probably far more like more of the people in the audience working in human services organizations here in New York, so I feel kind of like it's old home week for me in a way. So thank you for welcoming me back. I'm really excited to have the panelists that are joining us today, because we tried to put together a mix of people who have different kinds of portfolios and therefore will bring a different point of view to the question of collaboration and working for collective impact. I looked at literature on collective impact and collaboration, and there's all kinds of differentiations which I'm really not going to get into. I think really the point here is there value? Can you add value by having the sum be greater than the parts, right? That's what we're looking for. So I wanted to ask a couple of questions of everyone sitting here. And the first one, just to frame sort of your experience with collaboration. How many people here have been involved in some kind of collaborative effort related to your job, not your marriage or something? Okay. Okay. And how many of those collaborations were initiated by the organizations involved in collaborating? Okay. How many were initiated by funding entities? All right. Those are different experiences. We recognize that. How many of those are in operation now, continuing? Quite a lot, great. And how many that have been either completed or are still in operation achieved the goals that you were setting out for yourselves? Mixed, okay, great. So I've, just to tell you how we're going to structure this, I have some questions for the panel. They're not surprise questions, they know what they're being asked. And I've also asked them to join each other in the conversation a little bit, because I think that might help us to flesh out some of the questions that we have. And then as Claire said, there are cards that will be going around so that we'll have some idea of what's coming from you without having to go around the room at that point. So I'm going to start with Kavitha. And Kavitha Medarata works at Atlantic Philanthropies, where her work is on public policy in a national realm. So collaboration means something for you. And I'm wondering what about the work that you're doing in school discipline makes it relevant to and important to have collaboration?
Thank you, Lori. So I'd like to actually answer your question by taking a step back and just telling you a little bit of the story of Atlantic, which I think will help to make clear why collaboration for us is so important. So I lead the Foundation's work to reform school discipline policies nationally. And, for those of you who might not know Atlantic had been funding very broadly in the areas of education reform and juvenile justice reform for a number of years. And then in 2009 settled on zero tolerance school discipline policies as an intersection point between these two areas, and as an area where there were huge consequences for children, negative and racially biased consequences for children, but was an issue that really was relatively unknown. So nationally, for those of you who may not know, suspensions are freely dispensed in schools. And the sheer numbers are appalling. More than 2 million secondary school students were suspended from school in the 2009-2000 school year. 1 in 3 African American middle school students with disabilities, right? 1 in 3 nationally. And yet, very few people knew about this. I think the conventional wisdom is that suspensions are a way of scaring a kid straight, right? Of straightening them out, of making it so that when they come to school, they know they have to work. But the data is increasingly clear that actually what it does, it makes it far more likely that a child who may already be struggling in school will fail the grade, right? Will drop out of school, and will have premature and unnecessary contact with the juvenile justice system. So, for us, we looked at this, and, very few funders, luckily Lori at the Hazen Foundation was one of them that was supporting this work, but the lack of resources for it meant that it really undercut advocates' efforts to draw attention to it. So for us, the question was, how do you make an invisible problem visible? How do you put it on the national agenda? How do you build the capacity of systems to make the policy and practice changes that need to happen to change from a punitive approach to school discipline that pushes kids out of school into one that actually creates healthy school climates and that engages and motivates children to learn? And so for us, the answer was completely in collaboration. It was about collaborating with parents and students locally to build pressure to make change happen. It was about collaborating with civil rights organizations and university-based academics to look at the data, to analyze it, to make that visible. It was about collaborating with judges like the Chief Justice Judith S.K., the former Chief Justice of New York, as well as with teachers and with principals and with superintendents and school boards to build their awareness, right, of what was going on and what the alternatives were. And it was about collaborating with other donors to drive resources to these issues, because at the end of the day, money makes a huge difference, right? And we knew that organizations in the field needed it to be able to push this change. So for us, collaboration was very central, and the way in which we thought about it was both about building tables for organizations to be working together, for groups of parents and students to be coming together, but also tables that brought a diversity of voices together to plan out what a strategy could be. And for us as foundations, a key resource obviously for us is the money and to provide that funding, but that's not the only way in which foundations can work in the field. And so part of it was really collaborating and learning from the diversity of stakeholders that we brought to the table. So I want to just say, Lori, in answer to your question, I think the first question really is why collaborate at all? And that when you enter it, you need to be clear about why you are doing it and what you are doing it for. And for us, we are an international foundation. We had a national policy change agenda, and it was clear to us that a diversity of players were needed to make change happen, that the different sets of expertise, of knowledge, of experience actually was very critical to moving change, because schools in the U.S. are decentralized. It's a very complex system. It's not the kind of change that just can be engineered either by the federal Secretary of Education saying things need to change, or even here in New York City, the Chancellor. It's something that needs to be owned, right, by communities, by schools, by people, and on all different roles in the system. So that was the first thing. And then the second reason why collaboration was really important to us was because it actually takes a diversity of tactics, change tactics, to make change happen. It's not just about people on the outside of the system protesting. It's also not just about one teacher in a classroom making change happen. It's actually, and it's not about litigation, right, that's going on here in New York City to make change happen, but it's about the interplay of those things that are what are so critical to helping systems to move.
So that brings up a question for me, which is, you've talked about all these diverse partners and the differentiated roles that they play in bringing this about. What are the challenges to bringing those parties together that you've encountered, and how have you dealt with those?
Yeah, I think that there are kind of two things I've learned, and one of them is real clarity about your agenda is critical. And so early on in our grant making, we tried to bring our grantees together, and funders do this all the time. You know, you probably have been subjected to this. And so you come into this meeting, right, and there's all different people, and we're all saying how we all want to collaborate and work together. And what we found was it was a complete disaster. That the parents and students were talking about the need to put pressure on the Department of Education here in New York City. And meanwhile, the judge was sitting there sort of very uncomfortable. Some of the academics were a little confused. And so what we realized was, and not to say anything bad about academics, but the point just being that what we realized was that you know, we don't all have to be doing the same thing. We just need to be pulling in the same direction. And often we think that what we do, right, where we have raised our flag, our method is the right way. It's the way that things should be done. But actually, in the real world, that's not the case. And so what needed to happen was an understanding that all of us doing our different roles, our different areas of work was critical, but we needed to knit that together around a shared agenda of where we ultimately wanted to go. And I will say that that kind of thing takes time to develop, because it rests, the bedrock of it is trust and relationships among players, and that is about process, which unfortunately I think foundations often don't invest in, but is absolutely critically important, because without that, right, then you're competing with each other or arguing with each other about which strange strategy makes the most sense, when in reality all of them are needed.
Another thing I think from the point of view of foundations, of course, is it's also about resources, and I think that we as a sector can be quite guilty of thinking differently about how we resource different pieces of that work. Advocacy and litigation might get a different level of resources than organizing or practice, or research gets another, you know, and I think that came up for you also in this work.
Right,
probably, yeah.
Very much so. Because I mean, I think that these are hard decisions, right? And when you're in a foundation, your resources are not unlimited, and you're trying to figure out, well, what's the most strategic place to put them? And often then what we do is we'll decide one change strategy, whether it's litigation or whether it's research. One of those things is the most important, and that's where we're going to invest. But the truth is that you actually need all of them, and you need to figure out a way either to resource it directly, or how you're going to work with those organizations and people to attract more resources to them from other places. But I think that that's exactly right. It's critically important.
Yeah. So I want to move over to Deb, and your portfolio is very different. It's here in New York as opposed to a national portfolio, and there's a greater focus on services. and the provision of high-quality services in a variety of areas. Some interest in policy and how it affects that, I understand. And so I'm wondering, for you and your institution, how do you think about engaging in collaboration and when it makes sense?
I think there are two pieces of this. We think about both when it makes sense for organizations to engage in collaboration and how we support that, as well as when we're thinking about how we engage in collaboration. So I'd like to talk a little bit about both of them. In terms of when collaboration makes sense, obviously the main point of this is when there's a greater impact to be had. And so in this environment, the inability of organizations that are unable to do it all with scarce resources, the opportunities to build on comparative strengths of various partners when addressing complex issues such as poverty, engaging various sectors, the opportunity to seed programs of one provider to another that can do it more effectively, the importance of economies of scale, particularly given some of the changes in service reimbursement levels, and that are challenging the viability of some of the services that we care so much about, emerging needs and service gaps, changes in demographics and geography as populations move from one section to the city to another section of the city, and what the commissioner talked about in terms of some of the capacity challenges that sometimes brings as well. Different linguistic and cultural competencies, efficiencies in terms of back office and facilities, sometimes the ability to attract specialized talent that a smaller agency won't have, but perhaps working in partnership with others. So, and then also building, having a place for an organization that has really strong programs, but perhaps needs a stronger organizational home for them. So so those are some of the reasons why service organizations are thinking about collaboration, and why we look at why we may support that. In terms of service delivery, there's a lot of collaboration is a really big tent, and sometimes it's talked about in the formal sense as well as the informal sense. So kind of talking about the formal sense in terms of mergers and acquisitions and long-term partnerships that change the structural nature of the arrangements that organizations have. We all remember many forums, perhaps some of them in this very room at the beginning of the economic downturn, where there was a lot of conversations about wholesale consolidations of organizations and what that was going to mean. That didn't happen. That didn't happen immediately. But what we're seeing is some very thoughtful work by organizations trying to figure out how do we not only survive, but how do we thrive? How do we work differently to be more sustainable? Some of that work has been supported by the New York Merger Acquisition and Collaboration Fund, NYMAC, which is housed at Sea Change Capital Partners. Altman is one of 16 funders that helped to create NYMAC. And what it does is provide the money that many times organizations try to get from foundations, but it's difficult. It's sort of the one-time cost associated with collaboration, and not just mergers and acquisitions, but thinking about joint purchasing and administrative collaborations, co-locations. If your programs are happening in the evening and in the daytime, the classrooms are empty, could you have an adult literacy program in that space? Those kinds of things, but things that happen in a long-term way, and how do you support those collaborations? So if you're looking for that kind of support, I encourage you to look at the NYMAC, that's nymac.org. In terms of the other banner of collective impact and collaboration, there are lots of things happening in terms of systems alignment, as well as promise neighborhoods, lots of locally grown efforts. Some of them are place-based, some of them are about service integration, and Altman supports several donor collaboratives that seek to support organizations that are trying to maximize their impact in concert. The New York City Workforce Funders Group is one of those donor collaboratives that we support, and supporting both the convening roles and the planning as prerequisites to successful collaborations among various actors, as well as some of the demonstration projects and capacity building projects that result from it. Some examples are the New York Alliance for Careers in Healthcare, which is bridging the gap between employers, trade associations, unions, CUNYs, training programs, and community-oriented training providers regarding the type of preparation that new and incumbent workers need to be successful in the changing health field. Because what we were having were that very well-meaning entities were sort of working in isolation, doing what they knew to do, but not having the best information about how the world was changing and how they could be more impactful. While it started as a privately funded initiative, it's become more successful and scalable because it's a public-private partnership, and that the Department of Small Business Services came on as a partner, and they were able to bring some of their training dollars and resources that the private funding wouldn't have been able to do. And so while we sometimes talk about service collaborations as an entity unto themselves, when we're really talking about scale and change and sustainability, ultimately they need to evolve to look at the systems issues. And that was also the case when the Workforce Funders and the Clark Foundation brought together a cross-sector, had a cross-sector convening in the fall of 2011 to a variety of players in the workforce field that we talked about. And what resulted from that meeting, as well as a series of planning conversations, which were eventually supported by planning groups of self-directed efforts, where a series of integrated service models where people were coming together, as well as some efforts around advocacy and systems redesign, including a blueprint for changing the workforce development system, which is known as being very fragmented, and that's called the Re-envisioning the New York City Workforce Development System.
So it sounds like you went through quite a number of different collaborations that seem to have very specific goals for each of them, and are differentiated by the parties involved and who they're serving. But I'm wondering if you can identify some sort of through lines around some of the challenges that emerge in each of them?
Sure. In terms of partnerships and collaborations, they're not a panacea for the issues that individual groups are facing, and so that doesn't disappear, and in some cases they get magnified by the requirements of working together. And anyone that in the room that's been in a collaboration knows that there's this grand idea of being more effective and being more efficient, but in the short term that sometimes takes more time and money before you get that bigger bang for the buck. And then looking at some of the other operational challenges, the things around arriving at consensus around the nature of the partnership and its goals and its geography, like how do you define success, the match between the resources and the scope. Sometimes service initiatives have a large geographic scope, a large population scope, but then they're challenged with the set of resources that are coming to bear on those, while often the service partnerships and collaborations are bringing new interests to communities and resources, but some of the underlying issues related to the fragmentation of different funding silos and services and undercapacity, those things need to be worked out and intentionally driven for. The capacity for evaluation and data collection, both within the partners as well as across the initiative or some, and then the infrastructure to keep the collaborative together. In that, I think as funders, I mean, we're all nodding, we've all been in the meetings where everyone's really earnest, and then life kicks in at other priorities, and so someone that's keeping that going, whether it's a backbone organization or sometimes there are entities that are created for that purpose, really being important. So those are some of the.
Those are helpful, thanks. So Kevin, you're up. Your work is actually with some of the organizations Commissioner Chung was just talking about, the smaller community-based organizations.
I'm glad he said that. That was fantastic.
You tweeted that, I saw
Love
that.
it. Yeah, I did tweet
Yeah.
that.
You know, of course, some of what Deb was talking about around capacity comes up, but I think you've used collaboration to look at the issues of capacity. And I wonder if you can share how that has worked.
So good morning, everybody. I first want to give credit. We started our capacity building program about 35 years ago when we were all babies, 35 years ago. And it was one of those things that we didn't actually initiate it. We didn't see it. It was our grantee pool that saw it. And the grantee pool came to us and said, we need dollars. I mean, we fund mostly startups and small organizations. We need dollars to be able to build our capacity if we're going to address these issues that we set out to address. So I give the groups a lot of credit for having the foresight to see the importance of building that out, because this was at a time when most funders did not see capacity building as an important component of helping organizations do their work better. So about 12 years ago, we were doing a series of trainings as a part of our capacity building program. Overall, it includes trainings, it includes small grants for organizations to identify their own capacity building providers. And then we have organizations that we provide contracts to, like Community Resource Exchange, to provide those kind of services for our grantee pool. So about 12 years ago, we were doing these workshops essentially on our own for many years. And we were taught, it was just a conversation in a funder collaborative that we had, a conversation about a particular training around grassroots fundraising. And one funder mentioned that we should actually work together on this. It makes sense for us to pool our resources together to bring these trainers here from California to provide this service for our grantee pool. And so 3 of us decided to do it, and that's what started the kind of collaboration around this. The players have changed over the years, but at this moment we have 7 funders. We all fund, for the most part, our grantee pools are small community-based organizations. So there is some connectivity across the board, and also we share grantees in common, so that makes it a little bit easier for us to collaborate. And we all put our resources in, and I'll be honest with you, the pool of resources goes from some funders put in more than $50,000 to some funders who put in $3,000. But everyone shares equally in allowing their grantees access to these resources, which is somewhat unusual because in many cases, when you're a part of funder collaboratives, whoever puts the most money in usually has the most say about that process, which can be extremely annoying. But in this case, we decided up front, it didn't matter. It was about supporting the grantees, giving them opportunities for high quality capacity building services, and also an opportunity for groups to meet in these trainings and actually talk to one another. So in each of the trainings, not only was it about a specific organizational development capacity issue, say a board development training, but we also built in space in these trainings to allow groups to actually sit and talk and just take a half hour, 45 minutes to actually share with each other what they were doing. And there were a lot of collaborations that came out of these meetings amongst the grantees, which was an added benefit to it. The challenge one of the challenges I think that we've had is that we always want to make sure that as we are developing the different trainings that we have, that we get a lot of grantee input in this process. So we actually do surveys at the end of every single training just to assess in that moment how well those trainings went. But we now have instituted an online survey at the end of each year to ask grantees how they've actually implemented strategies from the trainings that they received. And that has been extremely helpful. This past year, in fact, about 250 groups attended our trainings, and about 40% of those actually filled out our survey, which is a lot. it's the most we've ever had. But it gives us that kind of feedback about the kind of trainings that we have and what are successful, what are not, and also other trainings that we should consider. So what we actually do is set up an 18 training schedule, 18 different trainings over an 18-month period of time. So we'll recycle trainings that people really like, but we try to include as many new trainings as possible in that process. And then the final piece of this that I think is sort of interesting is we've tried to find ways to build in as much follow-up support as possible into these trainings. For many years, it would essentially be one-off trainings. You go to a training, you get the information, you go back to your office, you put it in a cupboard somewhere, and maybe you pull it out at one time, or maybe you did. Now what we try to do is build in opportunities for grantees to follow up multiple times with the trainers and the consultants. So, for example, the grassroots fundraising training that I mentioned before, not only is it a 3-day training that you get up front, but over a 10-month period of time, you actually come back for follow-up trainings to talk about implementation of strategy. You get opportunities to do one-on-one assistance with the groups. And all of these things that I'm mentioning, the sort of changes in this program, have all come about because each of our institutions has come to the table, has brought our own experience to the table, but also we constantly talk to our grantees about their needs, and each funder brings that back. So it's been a really great, it's really been great to actually keep this going with this set of funders. But as Deb mentioned, one of the things that has been probably the biggest challenge in our group is, as grant makers, we all have different deadlines for our grant processes. Sometimes someone can't step up and provide information, or can't step up and help facilitate trainings and things like that. So we really have to be nimble, and some of us take on more responsibility at certain times than others. But it's worked. It's been a very effective collaborative, and each year I think it's really helped, particularly these small groups and a lot of these startup groups, to build their capacity in a lot of different areas in several years where it may have taken 5 to 10 years to do that.
So it's, what I'm hearing is a very sort of organic evolutionary process that is based on pull by the grantees rather than push by the foundations. But I'm wondering, how do you deal with when you have a grantee that is really reluctant to participate and really could use the help?
Yeah. This is where it helps to actually have a lot of grantees in common, because we do use this opportunity as a way to discuss specific groups for a particular training, let's say. So if we talk about, for example, a number of us support organizations that use community organizing as a major strategy for their work. Some of them are in very early stages of building out that capacity. So we actually hold we held 2 trainings this past January. One around community organizing, sort of basics around organizing, and one about direct action. How do you actually develop direct action activities? So in the conversation, we will often talk about, well, who is this workshop geared towards, and which of our grantees do we feel like this would really be helpful to? So we won't mandate that a group attend a training, but we will make sure that we offer this service. And if that's not something that they want to take advantage of, we can often then offer them other capacity building opportunities, small grants and other things. One of the things that's very helpful for those of us, not all of our foundations do site visits, but for those of us who do site visits, some of this is built into that process where you can go back and talk about capacity building opportunities and needs that groups have around capacity building. And we can share that within the group. So the group there is a cone of silence within the group. We don't actually share information outside of this about specific groups. And we also will be very careful about how we share information about the capacity of different organizations. But it has become a real safe space to have those kind of discussions too.
So it does, I mean, that I would imagine becomes one of the fears that grantees would have if they know we need help. Are we going to get the next grant? They don't think we're good at something. So you found ways to ameliorate those kinds of fears?
Not always. Not always, but I do feel like, I mean, there's a bigger question about the power dynamic that exists within philanthropy. And I feel like that, I mean, there's no way to eliminate it, but there are ways to work on it so where grantees will understand that our site visits are, we're trying to help the group to be able to raise more money from other institutions. We're trying to help groups to tell their stories in ways that will resonate with other foundations, that will resonate with other groups, that will resonate with the media. We really want to be helpful, and we've sort of backed off a lot of the dangling I'm going to say the stick, using the stick to encourage grantees to participate in capacity building. We really see it as a way, and I'll be honest, I mean, one of the things that we try to do, each of the program staff, when we do site visits, we really try to go in and build a relationship with the organization. We wouldn't come in the first year of a grant and say, boy, you really need to do this. Your board is just not up to. We wouldn't do that. We're going to come in and work with the group, talk with the group, help work with them to assess what some of the needs may be, and then make suggestions about what could be done to help in that process. I would say maybe in 80% of the cases, particularly with startup groups and emerging groups, we're successful. There's another 20% that no matter what we do, that power dynamic is just too great, and we can never break that down. And I totally understand why that exists. So it's not a negative perception of these organizations, but I can understand why nonprofits, I mean, I used to run a group. I know you have to be very cautious when dealing with your funders. Give bad news very slowly.
So just as a reminder, there are cards. We're going to be going to questions from the audience pretty soon. So if you want to get questions down on the cards, there's staff, wonderful people coming throughout the audience for that. But I do want to sort of ask all of you, there's two kind of areas that are coming to my mind that might be interesting to think about. You know, this is all about funder-driven collaboration. That's because that's what we do, right? So what about that, and you started talking about power dynamics, obviously that's a big one, but what about the fact of a collaboration being driven by funder interests do you think is something that there needs to be cognizance and respect for, you know, how do you pay attention to that? And the other piece about it is, since I think people in this audience might wonder, well, what's the difference between approaching a collaborative and approaching an individual foundation for resources? So you can take either of those, both of those, at will.
In terms of some of the challenges of funder-driven collaborations is that they sometimes have a lifespan. While the work in communities or the work or change efforts have, you know, they go on and they evolve, and so sometimes the expectations of funder collaboratives or even funder-driven initiatives that aren't collaboratives run up against that. There's a lot of thoughtful literature by on the comprehensive community initiatives, and so some aspects of the current collective impact work reflect some of those lessons. The Aspen Institute has done some thoughtful retrospectives on that, but in terms of initiatives looking at, if they're funder-driven, looking at the questions around sustainability and scale at the beginning, as opposed to at the end as an afterthought, being clear around those expectations around that for the funder, but then the challenge of how do you build strong organizations as well as strong communities that are able to gain resources and be responsive to need and set agendas, not just for the life of the initiative, but in an ongoing way, and how do you build that in as well? The limits of philanthropy's role and appreciating what that is, and that gets to some of the systems change dynamics as well. But then the challenge of funders appreciating the power dynamics that we've been talking about and not being overly prescriptive, which is hard because we have our own institutional priorities around demonstrating impact and mission and time, and that the fact that funder collaboratives aren't monolithic, even though we may all show up in, you know, similar black and gray suits, but with, well, great accessorized ties, I would say.
Don't get the watch.
But that, you know, but that we're all
New York.
different, and
It's
that
New
some of the dynamics that are happening within your own collaboratives around the goals of the collaboratives and the evolution are also happening within the funder collaboratives. And so the challenge is that we also need to be learning organizations and be able to mid-course correct and be transparent about that, but that's really scary. And sometimes grantees experience it as the funders have all this money and they don't know what they're doing yet, but I have to kind of bear with them. And so I think for this to work, we have to be better about collaboratives, and our collaborative partners have to be better about holding us accountable in that process. So those are.
So I have a thought about this. I'm really struck by the kind of grantee dialogue that you described, because I think as a national foundation, you kind of float in the stratosphere, occasionally landing. And sometimes people are happy, sometimes they're not. But I think that one of the things that this really strikes for me is just the importance, the real importance of prospective grantees being tactfully candid with foundations about what they see as the issues, right, and what they think is the way forward. So, you know, there's different kinds of collaboratives. There's the kind of pooled donor funds where you've got a lot of or initiatives like what you described around capacity building, where you've got a lot of donors sitting at a table trying to do something together. And then you've got foundations, just single foundations, sort of trying to fund collaborative efforts of grantees. Both are very complicated, but I think that to the extent that there's clarity about where it is ultimately that we're trying to go, right? It supports the kind of then more honest conversation about how we get there, and that does have to be bi-directional. And I think that sometimes people don't say what they could say to funders because they're nervous that it might, you know, endanger the prospect of funding, but it's pretty important to do so. You know, I think of one time when we had just started the school discipline work, and called, at this point this was a coalition, a national coalition that had been emerging over a couple of years without any funding to work on federal advocacy around school discipline reform. And we called them and literally said to them, okay, can you get a proposal into us for $1.5 million by tomorrow? And, you know, so of course they did, right? Like, who's going to say no to that? But what happened was this was a coalition that had formed of youth organizations, of parent organizing groups, of civil rights groups, of legal advocates, and this completely destabilized the coalition, right? The civil rights and legal groups that happened to have development people that, you know, had more time during the day to take this on, you know, sort of completely controlled that process of developing that proposal. And so ultimately what we faced was the very thing that we were trying to support, we were potentially completely destabilizing it. Of course, we were new on the scene and didn't have the relationships, right, with the grantee where they could say to us, I know what you're trying to do is help us, but this is actually not a helpful process. Instead, they went to Lori over here, to the Hazen Foundation, and got some resources to support the youth and the community groups coming together to figure out what their agenda was and what the governance of this coalition and what the priorities of it needed to be that would fully support the participation of the full range of stakeholders. Now it's at a point where every time we do renewals, it's a really thoughtful bi-directional conversation about, you know, how do we support, give them resources in ways that are going to really help them get to where they want to go and where we also want to go. So just to, you know, underscore what has been said already.
We didn't give them close to 1.5 million, by the way.
Let me just make one, you know, I was, about 6 months ago, we started a blog at New York Foundation. I don't know why, but we did. Sorry, Maria, I'm just kidding. This video is taped, my boss, Maria, I'm sorry, I'm kidding. But I decided I wanted to actually write some provocative blog pieces. So one of the ones I decided to write was, with a nonprofit organization, is how do you push back on funders when you know their strategy is the wrong strategy? You're on the ground, you know the strategy is the wrong one. I'm still trying to find a group that will openly talk about this with me, and okay, I'll talk to you afterwards, okay. But I think one of the things that really bothers me is about this is that oftentimes funders will often force collaborations in ways where they're not understanding the cultural, strategic, ideological, and constituency differences between organizations. They don't even consider it. I mean, and often if the honest and transparent dialogue doesn't take place up front, what ends up happening is the funders' expectations are already lofty and unrealistic. I mean, that's, you know, the nature of our business, I think, in some ways. But I mean, and then funders walk away disappointed, thinking, boy, these groups couldn't pull this together and do it. We're not going to invest going forward in some of these groups, so they're going to have to make big changes before we think about investing in them again. You go away thinking, well, these funders are just nuts. They don't really understand what's happening on the ground. And if some of that dialogue had happened up front, if there had been some honest conversation about what could actually be accomplished in this collaborative, what's realistic to think that we could get done in the 3 or 5 year time span most funders have to get these things done, I think we would be better off. I think we would, and in some ways it's a challenge for a lot of us because our boards hold those lofty expectations about what can get done with the money we have. And it's hard for us to push back on our boards and say, let's just be a little realistic about what we can get done with this money when we're trying to change and transform these huge, huge issues in our communities. So I feel like that there's a way that this is just, and this is my opinion, this is not the New York Foundation talk, but Kevin Ryan. I feel like that using your funders who are your allies, who you see as your allies, to help you do some pushback can actually be helpful. I have a unnamed colleague who approached me because a foundation wanted to force a collaboration between her group and another group that has always refused to work with her group, has always refused to do it. But this funder decided that they should work together because they were doing the same thing. She called me and said, is there any way you can help me just to talk to this funder and help them think about this, how little sense this makes? So I did. I called the funder and I just said, I don't know if you know about this, the relationship between these groups, but it's been very challenged over the years. And the funder understood it and actually then decided, well, we're going to have to switch the strategy and come up with something different because they both need to be at the table in this collaborative, but let's find another way to get them to play important roles in it. So they did sort of change that strategy. That's probably one example that might never happen again, but it's a good example, though, of using your relationships to help you to get information to grant makers that we may not have. We're not there every day on the ground. You are. You know better than we do about a lot of these things. And if there's other ways to kind of circumvent this process, I think it's very helpful to do that.
Great. So I have some cards, and they're grouped in some different ways, or I'm trying to organize them so that we can get through as many of them as possible. But the first one asks about opportunities for private-public funding collaboration and whether the panelists see opportunities for that or have experience with that. I don't know. Who asked about public-private? Someone? Did I get that right? Well done. Thank you.
Yeah, I gave the example of the New York City workforce funders as an example. The commissioner talked about the expansion of middle school programming in New York City. I'd imagine that there may be some opportunities for private funders to think about what that expansion of dollars means for the infrastructure in the city and the ability to absorb it. There have been some important collaborations around summer learning, which in the city that have been supported, that DOE, DYCD, and a collection of private funders have supported both community-based organizations that are providing academic enrichment as well as academic programming in the summer, as well as enrichment activities in really robust, engaging ways and having a difference in impact. So I think there are lots of examples of that. I think the old model of the tidy demonstration project that doesn't have any input from the public sector, and then we try to sell it, that doesn't work. And so I think in a more organic way, those partnerships need to continue to happen.
I will say that we at the federal level have done a fair amount of work trying to figure out how you support public-private partnerships around this. And so one very concrete example, again, because we're focused on school discipline reform, was working with the Department of Education to figure out, well, how do you actually provide the resources for the kinds of positive strategies that we want in schools, and also support systems to start looking at the alarming data around racial disparities and figure out ways to address it, which in some cases actually requires, innovation. It's not that you're just picking a program off the shelf and sticking it into schools. And so what we developed with them was, and it's the same principles about sort of ongoing dialogue and relationships around sort of clarity what the common goal is. But what we developed was a project where a number of school districts were able to draw down on federal dollars to implement positive behavior intervention supports, which is a program in schools that tries to address climate by also identifying children who have special additional behavioral needs and really trying to get them the supports that they need. So it's sort of a whole school and with an individual student component. But what we tried to do then was to say, look, we have additional resources that would be available to these districts to actually start looking at the racial disparities data and to try and do some problem solving with community stakeholders around what those issues might be. So, two separate things going but aligned, right, in a way to sort of try and help school districts to look more thoughtfully at those issues. So that's
Great. Another question which someone posed is, when there are nonprofits that are, and I'll use our phrase, invested in their particular way of doing things, and that can impede collaboration, how do you work through those challenges?
Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. I mean, there are groups, unfortunately, that have built up a certain culture or have certain leaders that are just not collaborative in nature, and they're not going to be a part of, no matter what you do, they're not going to be a part of a collaboration. I think what you really want to try to do is, I'll give you an example. There is a certain organization, and this is not in New York, so you all don't know this person. There's a certain collaboration of groups that came together, and one person who they wanted to bring in the group is a very powerful organization. They have a lot of state reach in the state they're in, but he's notorious for never collaborating. And he'll even tell funders, oh yeah, I'm going to collaborate. He'll take the money, he won't collaborate. So, but you have to invite him to sit at the table. So the strategy has just basically been, we just don't want this organization to impede the progress of the collaborative. So this person is kept abreast of what's going on every step of the way. They'll try to find ways to make the collaboration, at least in a peripheral way, the work they're doing connect into the work that the rest of the groups are trying to do. But the reality of it is we can't solve those problems all the time. In some cases, I've seen where groups, if it's a bigger collaboration, where groups will take aside certain people and say, we really want to make this work, we think you're an integral part of this, but in order for this to work, there has to be equal stake in this from everybody, equal engagement. And that I've seen that work sometimes, I've seen that not work. So I think it's really it really is based on individual leaders, and if they really recognize the importance of it, they'll try to come in. If they don't.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, and we were just trying to figure out who that was, but that's a different story. We have a little bet going on. We're going to check afterwards. But the other thing is that there's a culture that impedes it. It's not necessarily just the organization, and I think that we as funders need to take some responsibility for that, because part of that culture is driven on, the competition for resources, owning the success when someone, so if you get credit for the success that I think I should be getting credit for, rather than understanding sort of a way of shared messaging, or, it's a long road to have gotten us to this point. I think in the not-for-profit sector, it's dangerous, but it's really understandable. And I think that we have work to do on our side of this conversation to figure out ways to overcome that as well. And that means engaging with organizations that we may not already have a relationship with, because, it's a broader environment than just our grantee pool. So that's another thing. There's so many more questions, and I don't have a whole lot of more time. But this one was, I thought, interesting as well. And it's about how you target creating efficiencies in the process of assessment and need and the evaluation of impact. And I'm not going to pretend to know what they were asking, but I'm going to tell you what I think is interesting in this, which is that, you know, we expect a lot of evaluation and assessment time from grantees that takes away from the work that is going on. And so how do we think about collaboration in terms of either creating efficiencies to do that?
I think in terms of the local actors identifying what success is in a very clear way and aligning their efforts around that. And that can be really challenging because bringing lots of people together, their competing interests, everything is potentially important and impactful, but if you can't do everything together in a collaboration, and so I think making those harder choices around what success is, how you're going to align your efforts toward that, and then thinking about the evaluation that needs to be attached to that is important. But as I mentioned before, in terms of data collection and evaluation being a challenge for the organizations that gets magnified, it's something that as funders we need to support more of, and so that's part of the evolution as well.
So I think we're at time now. I hope that this was useful. I think we all felt the challenge of coming from the very different institutions that we come from, creating some relevancy for the work that you're doing, and I really hope we achieved that. So if you wouldn't mind giving the panelists who gave, I would say, a lot of thought.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lori, Kavitha, Kevin, Deborah. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Just a couple of notes as we transition to our next phase of the program. As somebody noticed earlier, we are videotaping today. This whole program will be available, as are all of our other symposia, on our website. It'll be ready in about a month, 2 months, something like that, maybe a little longer. But you can always go up and see all of the programming that will be on the stage today on your own throughout the year. The other thing I just want to mention is, I mentioned our charity review program. The BBB of Metro New York covers everything south of Albany, pretty much. We have our Western New York BBB here as well. They have also started a charity review program. So our state now joins about 50 other BBBs all over the country that are doing charity reviews. So I just want to make that note. Again, I want to thank this panel. Thank you so much. I believe some of you will be around for a while. We do have your coat. We didn't give it away. And in about 10 minutes, we will have David Birdsell, Dean David Birdsell, once again, talking about, with 3 other panelists, of course, defining and measuring impact. So, after the break, be back here in about 10 minutes, and we will have another engaging program. Thank you.